Yeah, my name is Jacob Audu, as you can see on the PowerPoint there. Yeah. The title of this paper is Wealthy Continent, Poor People, Pathology of Misgovernance in Contemporary Africa. I want to start by saying emphatically that any culture, any civilization, or a group of people that forbids intellectual, psychological, as well as historical evaluation of its challenges has not only denied the chances, but has failed to provide ability to identify the solutions to our challenges. So what this paper is out to do is to provide an intellectual discourse into the historical past to enable us to ascertain some of the facts that will help us to establish why we found ourselves where we are today as a continent of Africa. And by doing that, we want to start by raising some questions, which also will form as part of the objectives that this paper is out to interrogate. So it is against this backdrop of what I said earlier that this paper examines misgovernance as the pathology, as the key pathology to Africa's challenges of developmental problematic, especially in contemporary Africa. Now, this is not without prejudice to the historical facts or roles played by colonialism to the underdevelopment or backwardness of Africa. We are not doubting, we are not displaying or disputing the role played by colonialism and even the colonial vestiges towards the backwardness of Africa, but we want to create a departure from an established argument, established debate that we are where we are today because of the historical tendencies of colonialism. We want to create a departure from there by looking at the pathology of misgovernance in contemporary Africa. Now, in trying to do that, it has been established that the crisis, the challenge of development that is facing Africa today is so complicated to the extent that the UN itself, that is United Nations, has indicated that based on the present level of development, it will take African continent up to about 130 years to accomplish or to achieve what was established in the year 2000, which is generally referred to as Millennium Development Goal. Now, what it means is that by the year, it was stated earlier during the Millennium Development Goal that by the year 2000, the level of poverty in Africa should be halved. But by the year 2000, we couldn't achieve it. And the UN came up with a report that based on the current development, the year 2000, they came up with a report in the year 2000 that based on the current development, it will take Africa 130 years to achieve development. And as close as the year 2021, it was also stated that the gap between sub-Saharan Africa in terms of growth, in terms of development, and the rest of the world will be widened further in the next 5 years, which means based on contemporary development, the gap between Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and other parts of the world will be widened. And when you look at the challenges we are facing in contemporary Africa today, we can say that these challenges include issues of poverty, issues of poor education, issues of ill health, insecurity, violence, hunger, sustainable agriculture, nutritional problem, food insecurity, ethnic conflicts, infectious diseases, climate change, and among others has been the major plague that has been ravaging Africa. So this paper, as part of the problematic of this paper, is to attempt or to interrogate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. Why should the continent that is said to be rich, that is said to be endowed in terms of natural and human resources, also be said to be one of the poorest in the world? And when I say that this can be situated within the context of what we call the pathology of misgovernance in contemporary Africa. So in trying to do this, we raise some objectives. One, we want to find out what is Africa as a continent? Is it true that we are actually poor or we are rich? We want to establish that Africa as a continent is a wealthy continent. And by digging into the history of Africa, I want to give 1, 2, 3 examples to prove that Africa as a continent is not as poor as has always been stated by statistics, but we are endowed, yet we are poor. So that's one of the objectives that this paper wants to establish how wealthy is Africa as a continent. Number two, as an objective, want to also find out what is responsible for this continent that is so endowed and still categorized as the poorest. Want to also establish why is it that after about 4, 5, 6 years of political independence of this African continent, why is it that we are still growing in terms of debt to the point that we have found ourselves in the net of what we call debt trap? And coming out of it is as good as it is practically impossible based on the current dynamics of developmental indices. They also want to find out what actually explains this crisis. What is the nature of this misgovernance that is responsible for the crisis of development we are facing in contemporary Africa? Then finally, want to also prefer or recommend some solutions that will help us to establish, to help us to see how we can come out of this crisis of development that we are facing in Africa. Now, in trying to identify this paper is divided into several structures. The first one is the introduction, which establishes the problematic, the objective, and theoretical. We try to situate this paper in different theoretical paradigms. First, we look at it from the angle of philosophical scholasticism, looking at the ideas of scholars like Aristotle and see how they have tried to establish how governance can be, how wealth can be created using the ideas of innovations, creativity to establish development. They also want to look at the theory of neoliberalism. It has been argued by neoliberal scholars that within the context of neoliberalism, any country that employs the principle of neoliberalism, it is by default that that country will attain some level of development. We want to see why is it that after we have employed and embraced these policies, these neoliberal policies as projected to us by Washington consensus, why is it that we have not been able to come out of the mess of development crisis all these years? They also want to look at, again, from the angle of the social contract. By social contract, that the state evolved. What we know as the state today evolved out of the social contract, where the state have responsibility to the people and the people have some level of allegiance to the state. It is the dialectical relationship between the state and the people that establish the social contract. We want to see why is it that within the social contract theory, why is it that the state within the African continent has failed to provide the social services that will help them come out of this crisis of development? That is the theoretical plan we try to use to explain this our paper. Then we have established also that we rely largely on historical documents and also some official documents by UN and World Bank to establish the fact and to also establish that Africa as a continent is wealthy, yet is surrounded with the paradox of poverty arising from the case of misgovernance within the continent of Africa. Now, going to the nature, we try to put all this into context. We'll look at the contextual framework, contextual and conceptual framework, where we try to identify some of the key concepts in this work, like the concept of pathology. What is pathology? And here in this paper, we try to establish and define pathology within the context of an abnormality or a deviation from an acceptable norms of governance. There's an acceptable norm of governance. When we talk about governance, it essentially deals with the ability to use authority and power of the state to allocate the resources of the state and provide welfare for the people. But in our case, there's a deviation from this normal tendencies to what we call misgovernance, which is responsible largely for the crisis of poverty or development and backwardness that we face in Africa. Then we also try to look at we try to attempt to answer the first objective. What is our objective? We want to establish Africa as a wealthy continent. And here we have proven in this paper that it is historically on record that Africa had a proud heritage. How do we mean? The Black, truly, based on historical fact, truly built the first civilization. And this took place within the first 3,000 to 4,000 years of human existence. Within this period of human existence, Africa, the Black, has proven to have a proud heritage. And this is validated in so many ways. Number one, Egypt, for instance, was a land of advanced architecture with the world's oldest stone structure which is found in ancient Egypt, and also with what we know referred to as the Great Pyramids, and is found in Egypt. And this pyramid constitutes one of the 7 wonders of the world. All these are built within Africa, Egypt particularly, as a proof that Africa is not poor, but Africa is wealthy. Again, we also try to establish that Africans, especially the Black Egyptians, were proficient in mathematics, were proficient in medicine, in engineering, in agriculture, and even the Black Arab is on record started what we call algebra. They also conquered Spain and Portugal, and all this are established even before what we call Europe today began to experience what we refer to as civilization. Again, in volume 18, of African history, okay, volume 18 of African history or history of nations, it is also proven that the African continent is not a recent discovery. The African continent is not a recent discovery. Instead, it is not, and it's not a new world, like it has been said of other countries like America, like Australia, that have been thought to be a new world. Africa has been established. It's not a new continent. It's not a recent discovery. For instance, while Europe was the home of wandering, the wandering barbarians, we can say that one of the most wonderful civilizations that is on record has actually begun to work out its destiny on the banks of the Nile of Egypt, proving that as far back as 3,000, 4,000 years ago, in human existence, we are beginning to experience some level of civilization at the bank of Nile in Egypt. And again, according to Sowell, as recent as 1994, Sowell proved that ancient Europe was more underdeveloped than Africa. He gave an example citing that, for instance, in Britain, before ancient Britain was invaded and conquered by the Roman legions, not a single Briton had ever done anything to leave his name on the pages of history. Before the conquering of Britain by the Roman legion, it has been proven that no single Briton had ever done anything to leave its mark on the pages of history. And it's also proven that an estimated 1,000 years passed before the material standard of living in Europe began to rise and rose to the level achieved under the Romans. It took them over 1,000 years. And before this time, continent of Africa and Egypt had begun to experience high level of standard of living. Again, it has also been proven that as late as in the 19th century, no city in Europe had as dependable a water supply system as many European cities had in the days of the Roman Empire. These are they are on record and have been proven that all this had never been in existence before now. Okay. Now, to also add to what we have said, Volley, for instance, also said that the black race, let me quote him up now. He said, this race of black, who nowadays are slaves and the object of our scorn, is the very one to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of spoken word. And finally, recollect that it is in the midst of the people claiming to be the greatest influence of liberty and humanity that the most barbarous of enslavement has been sanctioned. What's he trying to say? He's trying to prove to us that the continent that we refer to as black, the continent that we refer to as backward, the continent that we refer to as barbaric, today had in the past been the source of civilization for the countries that we call developed or advanced countries today. Again, you can also say that the continent of Africa was once referred to as the golden continent. Why? Because of the abundance of wealth. The African continent was referred to as the golden continent because of the abundance of wealth that are prevalent in Africa. And because it was not prevalence of wealth that attracted so many to come to Africa as a continent. And it is because of those ones
that helped them to establish even what we call the slave trade. Now, Gronsky also said in his work, Slavery in History, that architects, artisans, merchants, mechanics, operatives, sailors, agriculturists, and shepherds of Egyptians, of ancient Egypt, were undoubtedly of Negro stock. Waterworks also said that modern canoes, modern flying missiles, modern ship propellants, automatic hammers, gas motors, meat cleavers, and even the unforced attack hammers were all developed in Africa's early use of power. All I'm trying to prove here is to establish that this continent we call Africa was never a poor continent before now. Okay? Then we also are trying to ask, to try to summarize it. And it's also on record that the continent of Africa was, as I said earlier, was referred to as the golden continent. Why? As I said, because of the abundance of wealth. And this abundance of wealth that were available in places like Egypt, in Ethiopia, in Timbuktu, in South Africa, and as far back as 2000 BC to about 1500 AD, the wealth of Africa was the chief or the major attraction of many people from different parts of the world. So why the white came to black? What was the source of motivation or that brought them to the continent of Africa? It was because the continent of Africa was referred to as the golden age because of the abundance of the wealth of Africa as a continent. Again, let's stop there. What we want to prove again that the continent of Africa that we used to know it today, in terms of abundance of land, Africa has a total area of about 30.37 million square kilometers. The continent of Africa is about 30.37 million square kilometers, which is 3 times this more than the size of China, the size of the US, and even that is about 2%. That is US now. It's about 2% of Africa. So when you look at the size of Africa in terms of landmass, we are saying that Africa is 3 times more than China, the US, and even about 2% of Africans over 30 million square kilometers, and it's about 40 million population of Africa. Now, when you look at Europe, for instance, when you put the entire Europe together, it's still less than the continent of Africa. The implication of all I've said of this is that Africa is larger than all of Europe, China, and the US of America put together. So in terms of landmass, when you put together the entire Europe, the entire China, the entire US combined, Africa, in terms of land, total land area, is still bigger and larger than them in square kilometer. Now, of this, in this size, about 60% of our land is arable land. What does that mean? It means a land where you can grow your crops. So 60% of our land is arable land, and 90% of natural raw materials. We have Africa continent has a gold reserve of about 40% and 33% of diamond reserve. It has a population of about 1.3 billion people with young demographic character of young population with an average of about 90 years old, which means Africa has a population of about 1.3 billion, and the population is favorable because we have a demographic youth, which constitutes about 33% of this population. Now, if Africa has this kind of qualities, it is within this context that Africa is projected to represent the future of humanity. Scholars have come to agree that Africa is the future of humanity. And it is also stated that by the year 2050, Africa alone will be able to feed 9 billion. Now, the population of the world today is about 7, 8, 9 billion. And we are saying that by the year 2050, Africa alone will be able to feed 9 billion people. Paradoxically, Ukraine, okay, has about 604,000 square kilometers. size. Yet, with Africa's large arable land, we have to depend on Ukraine for wheat. And arising from the Ukraine-Russia war, Africa has suffered the supply of wheat, thereby affecting the production of bread in the continent of Africa, and the price of bread has skyrocketed. Why? Because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And as I said, Ukraine has about 600,000 square kilometers compared to Africa. Yet, we depend on them for which to produce bread in Africa. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. Now, with this, we also try to provide a table here to show the continent of Africa and the availability of resources. When you look at the table, you see how endowed Africa is in terms of resources that's available to us as Africa. Now, the question is, with all this abundance of natural resources, with all this development, why is it that Africa is still categorized as the poor? Why is it that Africa is still backward? Why is it that Africa is wealthy yet inhabited by the poorest of people? What I try to provide answer to this one, to this question. According to what I mean, you observe that in a way, underdevelopment is a paradox. Why is it so? Because many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor. That is the paradox of our continent. You see, many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor, and parts that are not so well off, that is, they're not so well endowed in terms of length of soil and soil and so on, are also enjoying the highest standard of living. That is the paradox that this paper wants to address. That is the challenges that this paper wants to address. Why is it that the country that is enormously rich, that is endowed in terms of natural resources, yet inhabited by the poorest of people? We want to find out the answer to this question. Now, there are different theoretical paradigms that have tried to explain this question. For instance, according to David Ricardo, trying to justify industrialization, and he said that the industrialized England, as far back as 1817, that the pattern of development which they enjoyed was as a result of the growth of the manufacturing industry, manufacturing sector. And Eric Renard, a Norwegian scholar, also tried to explain why rich countries remain rich and the poor remain poor, by trying to emphasize that the continent of Africa is poor today, not because they're not endowed, but because they've embraced the policies of advanced countries, and the policies of advanced countries that discourage the production on the manufacturing sector and attempt to open up the economy and for the neoliberal ideas. And by doing that, when you open up your economy, you allow for influx of goods, thereby killing your home industry. And he said that, that's Eric Renard now, he said that the advanced countries of the world today, when they were at the stage of development that we are in now, they allowed their government to drive the development stride and therefore attain some level of development. And when they attain that level of development, they try to provide alternative platform for development, which is neoliberalism. And this alternative platform now discourages government from driving development and try to encourage individuals to drive the development of their state. And by doing that, we have found ourselves in the crisis of development which we have found ourselves in today. Again, we try to look at it again from the philosophical scholasticism. Aristotle has said that the crisis of development globally is more of a zero-sum game, where one country's gain is often seen to be other countries' loss. And by doing that, you require innovation and creativity for you to embrace development. So it is not enough for you to have an abundant natural resources. It's not enough for you to be endowed with enormous resources. There's a need for you to be creative. There's a need for you to embrace innovation if you must attain some level of development. And the absence of this innovation and creativity is largely responsible for why we have remained where we are today as a continent of Africa. And therein lies the dilemma of the African continent. Again, some scholars have tried to explain this crisis from the angle of what we call the dependency argument or the dependency syndrome. That is to say, the tendency and the ability of African continent to look onto other nations and other people for practically for everything. And when you look at them for everything, to sustain and keep your society going, it will amaze you to understand, to hear that Africa depends on other countries for things as little as toothpick, as little as pencil. Now, when you look at the demography of children going to school in Africa, you can discover that millions of children go to school, yet they depend on pencil produced and imported from other countries. We depend on toothpick imported from other countries. And we are saying, if we embark on producing this product in Africa, instead of depending on that country, then there's evidence that we attain some level of development. So the degree of dependency of Africa on other nations and other continents has, to a large extent, become so acute to the extent that it has, one can state clearly now, about 100 active 100 people in Africa. Active 100 people in Africa depends largely on 92 non-active dependents. And what is the implication of this? The implication of this is that when you depend totally on other country, the tendency for you to grow, to advance, to enhance your development become equal to zero. And Kofi Annan gave credence to this, where he said that he wanted that the continent of Africa was increasingly getting too dependent on international aid. And he said that Africa will never know peace. Africa will never know prosperity if they don't take responsibility for solving their own problem. Until we arise to solve our own problem, until we stop depending on international aid and the advanced countries for everything, that is when we need to start the place of development. And somebody may ask, is it possible? Well, that is where the challenge is because right from the time that Africa was incorporated into the international capitalist system of colonialism, which later led to what we call neoliberalism today, even in this age of globalization, our economy is designed and structured to serve as a dependent continent to the advanced capitalist country, where in the international division of labor, we serve as market for finished goods and raw materials for their home industry. And once we allow and sustain this, and compounded by international trade system, who does not favor us, this alone has crippled the development of Africa. So we need to break out, we need to break loose from this chain if we must attain some level of development. Therefore, we can say that it is quite apparent that most of African countries have their budgets. That is the proof part of it. It is apparent, it's obvious that most African countries have their budgets, their elections, and their development projects, apart from being defined by outsiders using Washington consensus and using other development agencies, they are based on the criteria and targets always being financed and supported by donor countries. And there's this popular saying that he who pays the pipers dictates the tune. Because we don't divide by ourselves, because we don't provide for ourselves, we are bound to be attached to the apron strings of the advanced capitalist culture, and that will not allow us to embrace some level of development. Again, we also look at it from the angle of what we call the internalist perspective. There is this debate, there is thesis, which we refer to as the internalist debate, that they argue that at the root of the case of our development of Africa is what they call the internalist thesis. The argument here is that at the root of our predicament is the graft and the poor leadership credentials of our leaders. The poor leadership credentials of our leaders who deliberately, consciously or unconsciously distort their concept, their understanding, their idea of what political power is all about. And they look at it from the angle to the benefit that they, as part of the ruling classes, they tend to benefit from it, and also the benefit that will accrue to their foreign supporters or superiors, or what we call foreign collaborators. Most of them serve as appendages to international capitalist organizations, and therefore they try to serve the interests, even though they are our own rulers or their own political leaders, they try to serve the interests of these people vis-a-vis the interests of their own people in their own continent. And because of that, we have found ourselves, because Africa, therefore, is where it is today, because of the selfish, acquisitive tendencies and the love of power, not for what it can provide for the people, but love of power for the political actors, for the benefit of the political actors. Indeed, we can say that we have been infiltrated by opportunists. Most of our leaders are nothing but opportunists who working for the dubious neoliberal capitalist world economy. They collude with local scavengers to overlook, to disregard the rule of law, and to gloss over the provident leadership of African rulers, and also to serve the interests of their godfather, whether within or without. This is largely responsible for our crisis also. Another thing I want to look at that as also responsible for our crisis is what I call the crisis of religiosity. The crisis of religiosity. What do I mean here? Here, I'm trying to say that many people in this part of the world, in Africa, will find it socially and morally advantageous to hypocritically profess our religious belief and to use religion to justify what we want, what we believe, and what we do. I'll give you an example. Every Sunday, you see millions jumping to the church to preach, to hear the word of God, and to pray. Every Friday, you see millions jumping to the mosque to pray, to hear the word of God, to hear, and to also to go and pray to God, because we believe we are very religious. Okay, someone said we are the most religious continent in the world. Now, this religion has not translated into concrete reality of providing, of initiating innovations and creativity for us. So, I will give an example of Nigeria. Nigeria is said to be the most religious country in the world, yet one of the poorest countries in the world. It has been proven historically that preceding civilization, preceding development in most advanced countries is revival. So it is not bad to be religious, but in the days of revival in other advanced capitalist countries, it exposes them to creativity, to innovation, to provide solutions that will solve their problem. But in our own case, we celebrate, we enjoy the fantasy of religiosity without translating it into critical thinking that will bring us on and help us to provide solution, African solution to African problem by leaving everything to God. When issues that are supposed to be solved by our thinking, by our creativity, by our innovation, we refer them to God, we leave them to God. I say God will do everything for us, which is very wrong. We can talk about the crisis of religiosity. Now, with this attitude of praying for everything and using our brain to do little or nothing, and refusing to tap into the intellectual capacity given to us by the Almighty to convert our natural resources and our endowment to meeting our needs, we may remain perpetually poor. Not because of what the world did to us, not because of colonialism, Mr. Barrow, but because we have failed to engage our intellectual capacity, our intellectual reservoir of critical thinking to provide a solution to our own problem. That is a major problem. Now, when you take a general look at foreign investment in Africa, it will amaze you to know that we have allowed developed nations to take advantage. We have allowed developed nations to take advantage of us while we are busy praying for supernatural intervention. For instance, China alone, at the moment, China is the current Africa's largest trading partner. And that's why I want to use China as an example. China alone, according to AFK China report, said that China has investment in so many countries in Africa. For instance, in Egypt, they have about 197 ongoing projects in Egypt, and they have about 99 firms established in Egypt. In Ethiopia, they have about 255 number of projects, and they have about 114 established firms in Ethiopia. In Nigeria, they have about 404 number of projects. And in the same Nigeria, they have about 240 established firms in Nigeria. In South Africa, they have about 280 number of projects, and they have 152 number of firms established in South Africa. In Zambia, they have about 273 number of projects and 125 number of established firms in Zambia. What is the import of this? What we are saying is that this figure I've presented, this table I've presented here is to justify Chinese firm in some African countries. And by the time you think of the investment of other countries like Japan, like Germany, like the US, like France and other countries, it will amaze you that while we are busy praying to God for supernatural intervention, these countries have invested, have their firms established here, and they are milking the economy of the continent of Africa at will because of our own carelessness. Again, to amaze you to also know that the DG of Nigerian Center for Management Development once stated as far back as 2014, about 9 years ago, he said that 60 million Nigerians spend about 1.6 trillion on the average on generators annually. 60 million Nigerians spend 1.6 trillion on the average on generators, purchase of generators annually. Incidentally, these generating plants are neither manufactured in Nigeria nor in any African continent. So it has ironically be expected that Nigerians have about, on the other hand now, because we are very religious people, Nigerians have about 2,684 churches established in the UK, while Indians have about 4,300 companies in the same UK. So when we are exporting churches into UK, Indians are busy establishing companies in UK. And Pakistans have about 6,237 companies in the UK. So I now say, let us challenge ourselves. It is time for us to use our mind. We have all it takes. All it is the environment and the leaders that will create the initiative and the platform for this to be established. And that is where we have challenge. And we try to be embarking in what we call by blaming, the blame game. Blame game has been part and parcel of poor countries. And we are saying that scapegoatism is very powerful, but it's a very destructive phenomenon. This is a situation whereby a person or a group of persons blame others. In our case now, we blame the colonial masters and advanced countries for whatever is wrong. And we are saying that enough is enough of blame game. It's time for us to arise and take the bull by the horn and confront our challenges and come out of this development crisis. This is because we must take responsibility for our development. Those who resort to scapegoating will never rise. And if they rise, at best, they will remain at the level of mediocrity. So we must arise and come out of these challenges. Now, let's go back to the pathology of misgovernance. What is governance? Here we have said governance essentially or principally refers to as the exercise of authority in government and the political arena, the exercise of political authority, the exercise of power. What do you seek power for? Power is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. But what you do with power determine whether you have governance or you have misgovernance. And that is what we are looking at. So we say governance means it's essentially the exercise of authority or government and the political arena. What is governance? Now, I want to establish here that governance has become a central component in almost all developmental discourse in Africa. And as far back as 1980, World Bank came up with a report that the challenges of development in Africa is challenges of governance crisis. That is, what we do with political power is largely responsible for where we found ourselves today. That is the summary of the argument there. Because what you do with political power determines whether you can move forward or move backward. And I've come to here to state categorically that when you look at most of African government, it shows that it manifests. This misgovernance manifests in different ways. It shows itself as one, lack of voice and weak accountability structure. Where there are so many people that have no voice in the continent of Africa. They are oppressed, they are suppressed, yet they have no channels of venting their voices, expressing their voices. And the accountability channels, structures, institutions are very, very weak. We have weak accountability structure. And the governing system has refused to listen to the voices of the suppressed, to listen to the voice of the oppressed. And because they have not been listened to, they have been excluded. And once you exclude people from governing the state, it affects the development of that state. That is one of the major challenges. Another challenge is that when you pick up Nigeria, for instance, I talk about Nigeria because it has been proven that with our over 200 million population, 1 out of every black you meet anywhere in the world, 1 out of every 5 black you meet anywhere in the world is likely to be a black Nigerian. So when you look at the paradox of development in Nigeria, you see that in Nigeria, for instance, we have continually found ourselves with official statistics that indicate that it's a continent that is endowed, yet is poor, largely because of our governance crisis. That is where we see poverty at this high level in the midst of abundant resources. It has been proven that Nigeria has earned up to about 200 billion US dollar just from one resource, petroleum. Yet, I'm just within the last 30 years, yet we have not been able to see how this enormous wealth has translated into concrete reality by improving the quality of lives of the people. At the root of it is what? Misgovernance, inability to use power of the state in the exercise of or the judicious use of its resources. That is the crisis we found ourselves in Africa. So we have seen this and we said there's a need to address it. So misgovernance, which is the pathology that is responsible for this crisis, has manifested itself in several ways. For instance, the desire or the penchant to rule for self-gratification. Most leaders in Africa, they look at power as an end in itself. Power is supposed to be a means to attain that end, but within the continent of Africa, power is seen as an end in itself. Largely, it's a rule for self-gratification. Political leaders, our rulers in most African government, have not been engaged in an effort to seek more life for all. Instead, they get more power to seek more life for themselves. That's the tragedy of misgovernance that we found ourselves in Africa. No wonder Ali Mansouri, as far back as 38, he once said that the challenges of misgovernance in Africa manifest in several ways. One of the ways is that African continent, countries in Africa, they produce what they don't use, and they use what they don't produce. It will amaze you to understand that most of the things we produce are things we don't need, the things that we don't use. And most of the things we use are produced outside of the continent of Africa. I'll give an example here. Africa produces 2/3 of the world gold, 2/3 of the world gold, 2/3 of the world's cobalt, much of the uranium used for nuclear energy and weapons. They all come from African countries, African mines. Guinea, for instance, has the richest reserve of bauxite in the world. Guinea has the richest reserve of bauxite in the world. But unfortunately, the company now mines aluminium in Guinea. Go and check. They are not owned by Guinean. They are owned jointly by either US, French companies, British companies, or German firms. So they're not owned by countries that own these resources. As far back as 1970, the town of Lumumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo was said that it possessed about 56% of the world's copper reserve. 56% of world copper reserve was located in the town of Lumumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But for many years, Congo has remained a source of mining of radium, a radioactive element that is useful for medicine, mine there, but not produced there. This is a tragedy of African continent. Now, African leaders met in what we call the World Economic Forum as far as 2015, and they said that Africa remains the least economically competitive continent in the world, the least economically competitive continent in the world. And the forum further added that they attributed the reason for this for the stagnation due to what they call structural factors, such as poor infrastructure, high transportation costs, and other economic and political factors that has crippled the development of this continent. And it's added that high level of corruption and government inefficiency, they have combined together with low levels of education, has made Africa to be a risky place even for business. So even with the attainment of democracy, have not been able to move forward because we still carry the authoritative tendencies that have been part and parcel of the system, and these tendencies are counterproductive to the economic development of the continent of Africa. As such, we have witnessed misgovernance manifested in low quality of public service delivery, in the health sector, in the education sector, in social services, and in addition to weak institutional capacity and institutional framework that should help us to develop. As far back as 2016, when 2006, Barack Obama came to Africa and came to Ghana, and he said it's time for us to build institutions and strengthen our institutions if we want to attain some level of development. That or to be able to develop and build our institutions, we may not be able to attain some level of development. Well, that is what he said. But whether we should build development institutions and stop building mighty men in quotes, it's a challenge that we need to confront today, or whether the institutions can withstand the pressure from the mighty men the strategy has produced for itself. It's another thing that we need to, because we have seen situations even in advanced countries where authoritarian leaders are brought to book by strong institutions of the state. But in Africa, we have seen individuals bringing the soul of the state down because they have assumed some overwhelming power that could dictate the goings in state institutions. So in the light of all we have said so far, we try to conclude by saying that African continent has probably the richest mineral deposits in the world, and it will practically be impossible to disassociate the wealth that built previous civilizations, particularly Western Europe, without, especially in the days of industrial revolution, without making reference to the contributions of African continent. You can't talk about the development of Western Europe today, especially in the age of industrial revolution, without recognizing, acknowledging the contributions made by the continent of Africa. However, Africa is still emerged into what I call the theory of easy pickings. We have found ourselves in what I call the theory of easy pickings. What do I mean by this theory? It simply means we prefer to go for easy borrowing and later sorrowing instead of taking responsibility. We prefer immediate gratification instead of taking responsibility. So instead of us to develop our structure and build our structure and produce what is best for our people, we prefer to borrow and to ultimately begin to sorrow, which is largely the product of what we call the pathology of misgovernance that we have tried to address. And we cannot say, can we go forward? Yes. We are not pessimistic, there's still a way forward. We have tried to make some recommendations here. Number one, we said here that Africa needs what we call economic liberation. And this liberation may be practically impossible if pursued at the level of individual states. What we mean is that no state individually can pursue this liberation on their own and succeed. So we need to come together as a force, as a continent. And this is made possible with the recent development in what we call Africa's Continental Free Trade Area. It's a platform developed recently that will help us to reposition ourselves as a continent, to enhance our capacity and produce development that we are longing for. This is because the African Continental Free Trade Area has the capacity to create an economy that is worth over $30 trillion. It has the capacity to produce an economy worth $30 trillion. And with the workforce of our month, 1.27 billion, with an environment that can give you what you need. With this, Africa can be in a position for development within the nearest future. Therefore, implementing the new continental free trade area will not only reduce Africa's vulnerability to global disruptions and disruption arising from the international vicissitude of the national market, but it will also boost our regional competition, which was said hitherto to be at the lowest level. It can boost our regional competition, it can improve productivity, it can attract foreign investment, and ultimately, it can promote security within the continent of Africa. Number two, Africa must also earn a foreign exchange. It is time for us to start earning foreign exchange. How do we do that? We can do that by examining what products will earn us more foreign exchange than what we have control or we have no control over. Now, recently I discovered that there is a mineral that is found in Maiduguri, Nigeria. They call it California. We're told that in the global market today, it is about up to about 16 to 20 million per kilogram. Yet it has not been explored, and it is being explored, marketed by foreigners at the moment. So we have this, but we are saying that we need to identify those sources that will earn us more foreign earnings, the one that we have control over, and develop our economy around such resources and generate enormous foreign exchange that will help us to advance our development by funding our infrastructure that will promote our development ultimately. Number three, we must also detoxify our politics and inject political hygiene into it. Our politics, we must borrow from the advanced Western democracies. Their democracy is based on what we call competitive politics, which is characterized with ideas, innovations, creativity, how to improve the economy, how to take from where they are to where they ought to be. But our own is surrounded with, our own is toxic. We don't discuss idea, we discuss person, we discuss religion, we discuss ethnicity. At the end of the day, we see ourselves crippling our chances of enhancing development in our continent. So we need to embrace, we need to borrow the idea from the Western democracies, because the democracy, I said, is competitive politics, which is characterized with ideas. They are politics largely competition of ideas, where political leadership has been demystified and seen as an opportunity to serve. Political leadership is not an avenue to acquire wealth. It's not an instrument for primitive accumulation. It's an opportunity to serve the people within the context of social contract we said earlier. The state owes the people some responsibility to provide some social provisioning. So your going there is not for yourself, but to provide the social responsibility to the people. So the state must embrace and go ahead to see how they can provide these social services to the people. In this 21st century, we are living in a knowledge-based economy. So we must embrace politics of competition for ideas and make political offices less attractive. It is not for self, it is for you to see how you can impact the lives of your people. This is because over the years, what you have experienced in our politics has been commercialization of politics. People even take loan to go into politics because they know that once they get there, they can recoup whatever they have invested. So we must detoxify our politics. We must sanitize with political hygiene and avoid this commercialization of politics, which is a threat to democracy, to nationhood, to development, and ultimately to the improvement of the quality of lives of the people. Again, we also said there's also the need for us to embrace good governance. Good governance, not as defined by the global standard, even though some elements are also to be embraced, but within the peculiarity of African country. We must see how we can identify the basic needs, identify the needs the communal tendencies that we inherited and build on it to see how we can address our own challenges within our own peculiarity, not necessarily what is obtained anywhere in the world. And this must be accompanied by commitment to reformation of government. We must reform our government within the context to be of people's high people priority. It must have the priority of the people, must serve the interests of the people. It must be an all-inclusive, ethical, responsible officials responsible for development. It must be all-inclusive. It must be ethical. It must be responsible. It must have the government that is responsible to the needs of the people arising from social contract, when the needs of the people becomes uppermost in the affairs of the governance of the state. And this can manifest in commitment. This can manifest in commitment to propel growth policies, commitment to propel growth policies, commitment to investing in people through education, through health, and through imperative of gender balance in the development strides of the nation. Again, there's need also for us to decolonize and deconstruct our educational system to reflect the realities of the 21st century. We must decolonize, we must deconstruct our educational system to reflect the realities of the 21st century. How do we mean here? Now, it is not enough to know that you have resources. It is not enough to know that you have abundant resources. It is expedient for educational sector to see how they will keep a synergy between the abundant resources and the educational system. So if you have resources, the educational system should be able to provide the link between the resources and advancement by providing how to convert, how to transform those resources to meeting the needs of the people. We should go from theory to the reality of the 21st century. And above all, we need a transformational leader. We need a leader in the lives of Lee Kuan Yew. We need a leader in the lives of Paul Kagame. With this is a leader that can transform a country from third world to first world, using the available resources of the state, providing quality leadership, providing responsible leadership, providing accountable leadership, providing transparent leadership, and with the political will to drive the developmental stride of the nation. Once this is done, I can assure you that we attain high level of development that we have been longing for, even in the continent of Africa. And we can move from the third world, from the last world, even to the first world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jacob Audu. That was very, very interesting. That was very detailed, and that was very straight to the issues of Africa. We thank you so much for this detailed discussion and for the insights provided. It has actually shaped our minds with these issues and possible solutions attached. We would want to take a time now for questions and answers. Are there questions, please? We can ask Professor, his all ears is listening.
Yeah.
Any question? He's listening. Any contribution, any area you don't understand very well, you can actually ask. You can look through to see. Prof, I was going to ask just a brief one.
Okay.
You mentioned issues of the challenges we are having at the moment with development and the problems of leadership and all that in Africa. I was trying to see how we can actually look at sustainability and the reality we have at hand. Of course, we know that the population in Africa is growing. The resources in Africa are not, we have suffered from this Dutch disease for a long time. Now we depend on the resources, only the resources, without thinking of other things. You rightly mentioned, we produce things we don't use, and then we export, we import things we need. Is there a relationship between what is sustainable about what we do now and what is not? Because sustainability is all about what we are doing now that can also benefit, that will not affect the future generation. Is there a relationship between what Africa is doing at the moment, or what the way Africa is producing at the moment, and the future of our children, of its growth, the development of its future? I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah, I'm clear. I understand. Now, in the course of the presentation, I said that Africa is said by the year 2050 to be the future of humanity.
Yeah.
That position is taken within the context of the availability of the enormous resources at our disposal.
Yeah.
But again, as we have said, that you have resources does not equal to development. You sustain what you have, but at the moment we don't have. So we are saying that we rely on advanced countries for almost everything. And it will also surprise us to hear that most of the things that we are using here are taken from here in raw form, converted to finished goods, and brought back to us. So the issue of leadership comes in now. Now we need a leader. As I said, it's not just a leader. As far back as 1983, Chido Achebe talked about the challenges of Nigeria is nothing but leadership challenge. What we need at the moment in Africa is what I call a transformational leader. We need a leader that will look at our challenges, though they are enormous, but can see hope out of it, but can see solution out of it. We need to create our own African solution to African problem. Most of the solutions we apply today, they are imposed solutions, and they don't take care of the peculiarity of African countries. So we need to provide our own solution to our own problem. Now, if you look at, I gave an example of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's one of the major platforms now, and the desire is to create an African economy that can sustain our economy. Now, if we give ourselves to it, if we commit ourselves to it, there's a potential in that. But we need to show some level of commitment. African leaders must first believe in it. Then they must also demonstrate some level of commitment to it. And by the time we do that, we have all it takes to sustain ourselves for now and without tampering with the future of our children. But we must take the responsibility. That's talking about the leaders must take responsibility to drive the development that we are talking about. We have all it takes. We need the initiative. We need the innovation. We need the creativity to transform these resources into reality that will sustain and provide for the future that we are all longing for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I don't know, at the moment, are there companies, are you aware if companies in the continent are taking advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Area to expand their businesses? Because that was actually the idea. Since we have this challenge of leadership, and you talked about not depending on our political leaders, are you aware if companies are actually taking advantage of the fact that they can move from one point of the continent to the other to market their products? Because one centrality of the problem of before after came into existence is the inability of traders to trade beyond borders, the inability of goods to move from one country to the other. They are mad, or rather they are prevented by our state restrictions. We know that despite the fact that there is an ECOWAS agreement on free movement of persons and goods, goods are still not able to move from Nigeria to Niger, from Niger to Burkina Faso to Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Bissau to Guinea. You see that's embargo. When you cross the border, you pay the Nigerian customs a service, for example, in Cotonou, before you can move into Togo, before you can move into Benin Republic. Even if you buy something from Benin Republic to move it into Nigeria, you have to pay the customs in Benin. you also come into Lagos, you pay the customs in this other part of the border. Unlike here in Europe, when you move from one country in Europe to another, you don't have to pay the custom excise because of the one trade one custom service here one custom initiative of the European Union. Are you aware there is progress at the moment with respect to the movement of goods and persons with the introduction, with the birth of AFTA? Sorry.
Yeah. Now you mentioned something. Remember, I said earlier that the commitment of our political leaders is a major requirement to this transformation.
That's true.
We have to agree as leaders and demonstrate commitment to this after of a thing. If we believe in it, we should remove barriers. Now, the neoliberal world, the neoliberal policies said, remove barriers, remove restrictions, allow trade to flow. And by doing that, it will promote growth and ultimately development. We have allowed that, yet it has not promoted development in our part of the world. Instead, it has crippled our own. So if we need the continent of Africa, if our leaders are committed to removing these barriers, if our leaders are committed to removing these restrictions, and if we also encourage ourselves to produce, if we produce what we need, we have an already established market for those products. For instance, I gave an example of pencil earlier or toothpick earlier. This is imported. That if we have pencil for the teeming millions of school children or pupils, you don't need anyone to look out for any other market anyway. You have the market already, but you need the factory, and we need government to drive these policies. If we say states, if we say individuals, yes, because the liberal world said government should reduce. That's what they call the rolling back of the activities of the state. Government should reduce their intervention, their involvement in economic activities. By doing that, the state, if we fail to get the state engaged in the productive activities of the state of our continent, we'll still have challenge because we have not developed our individual capitalists to the point of standing on their own to push for development. Most of them rely on the state. So it still borders on the commitment, the will of the political leaders of individual countries that constitute the continent to drive this policy, because let them see the future of Africa in it. Let them see the prospect in it for Africa. And if they see and they key into it without giving their loyalty and allegiance to their former colonial master or former trading partner, then that is where we can move forward. But at the moment, some of these countries, they feel if we allow that, the bigger countries in quote in Africa will subsume them and they'll become perpetually underdeveloped. But that is not the spirit behind the African project. We need to see ourselves as one and build the economy as one, because no country in Africa can on their own fight and break this chain. We must come together as one and push it. Otherwise, other countries will continue to take advantage, the advanced countries will continue to take advantage of us, and they'll keep us perpetually underdeveloped.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, yeah, we have questions now. Yeah. You can raise your voice so I can hear.
Professor, for your presentation. My question is about your last recommendation. You gave us two examples of transformation leaders. And some people say that they don't respect the democratic policies. They are not democratic leaders. So I want you to explain or to give your vision about this relation between development and democracy, how to we can get there between these two paradigms, policies. Thank you.
You're talking about the recommendations of democracy?
Yeah, the last one. Transformation leaders, you gave us the example of
Yeah. Now, when I talk about transformational leaders, as a continent, as a continent today, we have leaders, but the leader we need is what I call the transformational leader. And I give an example of the likes of Lim Kuan Yew. Now, Lim Kuan Yew emerged at a point, if you remember, most of the countries in Southeast Asia, the one we call Asian tigers today, most of them were at par or even below some of the countries in the continent of Africa in the 50s to 60s. But today they are moved from where we were to what they call the first world today, because they were able to provide, they are still provided for what we call transformational leader. Now, when Lim Kuan Yew took over, what he did was he tried to balance democracy with some level of authoritarianism. And that has to suit with the peculiarity of a society. Now, we must develop our system to suit our own peculiar society. We are not going to follow democracy as it is preached to us. If you look at democracy as we have it today, it's liberal democracy they are preaching. And liberal democracy is largely synonymous with capitalism. And African society largely were not capitalist. We grew as a communal setup. So if you are imposing a capitalist system on it, it's going to be an aberration that may not create room for development. So we need to redefine our own democracy to suit our own peculiarity until we begin to see the sense of inclusivity, until we begin to see embarking on policies that will capture the people that matters in democracy. The idea of democracy is designed to advance the interests of the poor, and the poor is the poor in its original context. Within the Greek ethnicity, the poor refers to the women, the vulnerable, and people that are ravaged in poverty. Today, democracy benefits the rich more than the poor. So we must embrace democracy within the context of addressing the key issues that borders on the poor, the vulnerable, the women, the children. Until democracy begins to address those issues, it will not translate into providing solution to our problem. Again, at a point, they have to close their borders. Whatever you need, you have to produce it. So we need to look at what we have now. That's what I talk about. We produce what we don't need, and we buy what we produce and what we don't need, what we don't use, and we use what we don't produce. So we should look at our needs and produce what we need, since there's an already existing market. So all these are suited within the context of our own hybrid. I call it hybrid of our own democratic structures. It won't be within the general liberal context of democracy. It will be within a kind of African style of democracy that will address our own peculiarity. That is the essence of it. It must address the peculiarity of Africa, not within the bogus liberal democracy as we have it today. And we need a leader that has the will. We need a leader who must be seen and accepted by the people as advancing their interests. At the moment, in most African countries, we have trust deficiency. Trust deficit is there. People don't even trust their leaders because over the years, the leaders have not justified the responsibility given to them. So we have trust deficit. So we need to have a leader that people can trust, and leaders that will have an all-inclusive system or structure that will advance and carry along every segment of the society. By doing that, it will go a long way in addressing some of the issues we have raised that borders on the development of our people.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah.
But no, my question was answered. I wasn't understanding the free trade part, but I have seen like the previous slide, and I understand that contribution to the businesses.
Okay. Any other question? Prof, I was going to quickly ask, with the election in Nigeria, like we know, Nigeria serves to be an important role in the African Union, as well as in the affairs of Africa. The after itself was consented to by most other countries, but did not come into effect until Nigeria had to sign. They waited for a long time for Nigeria to assent to it before it was ascended. It just shows the importance of Nigeria. If Nigeria does not accept something, it's like even if every other African country accepts it, it's not yet accepted. I want to actually ask, with the current election in Nigeria, with the current system in Nigeria, is there hope coming from Africa?
Yes, I will tell that there's hope coming from Africa with the current election in Africa. That is why the election in Nigeria attracted global attention.
It attracts global attention because, as I said earlier, it is often said that with over 200 million population of Africa, it is always assumed that 1 out of every 5 black men you meet anywhere in the world must be in Nigeria. So Nigeria occupies a very strategic position in the continent of Africa and in the world generally. Now, with this election, over the years, as I said, we have what we call trust deficit. People have lost trust in the structure of the state. People have lost trust in the leaders of the state. And as such, there's a need to regain that trust. Number one, that's number one. Number two, with the emergence of Asiwaju Ahmed Bola Tinubu, with his antecedents in Lagos, people have this tendency that he has a think tank, he has a team that can reposition Nigeria for development. And once that is done, it can help to galvanize other African countries and key into the vision of the Africa we're talking about. Again, the election has also thrown up so many challenges arising from the institutions of the state. Remember, I talk about building structures, institutions, and individuals. People have also demonstrated that they have no confidence in the election that took place recently. That is why we have seen manifestation of protest and the call for an cancellation, all manner of things arising from the election. However, if the president-elect is sustained and sworn in, I can assure you, within the nearest future, Nigeria will be repositioned and we'll see it affecting other African countries because of the antecedents of the president-elect in Lagos. His activities in Lagos has shown that it can take place anywhere in Africa. And that is the way I look at it.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you.
With this, we have come to the end of the session for the day. Thank you so very much, Professor. We really appreciate it. We apologize for the issues had, and we thank you very much for all your contributions. We hope that when next we call upon you to give us another presentation, you will be able to do even better. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.